Okay, this project is going to be made out of white oak, and this particular white oak is from a log that was at least 5 years old before it was milled. All the bark was off from it. We milled it, and now it's sat for about a year and a half, stickered at 4/4. Now I've moved it into the shop. I've planed it down to right around 7/8 of an inch, and I'm going to let it sit and acclimate to this environment for 2 weeks if I can help it, maybe 10 days, but we'll see. All right, it's actually been 10 days now, and I'm ready to mill this down to its final dimension. It's been clamped to the bench the entire time to keep it as flat and straight as possible, and the humidity in the building's 35%. We're going to see how much this moved in that period of time. Now I'll mention that this particular board is a rift sawn board, not flat sawn, so it should be generally stable, but as you can see, it's still cupped a fair amount. So letting it rest that 10 days was beneficial. Now I can plane it down just a little bit and get it flat again so I can start working with it and milling it down and getting it into this project. So I went through the whole stack and I did plane it all down. I did take it back and clamp it back down with some stickers and kept it flat on the bench for some insurance in between when I needed the boards. But then I took and I started milling this piece up, and this is what the legs are going to be made out of. I'm cutting them just a little long, so after the glue up I can trim them down to their final dimension. And then I took those pieces over to the jointer because I need one reference edge to be perfectly flat for the next part of this to work out effectively. And that's because on the legs I'm going to miter 4 pieces together so that the corners are the seams and I have continuous face grain wrap around the entire leg. And no, I did not mean to flip you guys off. And I will add that I did several test cuts to make sure that I did have a perfect 45-degree bevel on those cuts. After I cut all the small pieces and held them together, you can see I don't have any seams that are visible in this glue up, so hopefully this will be a good looking leg when I'm done. And yes, I realize that was a weird way to say that. And now all that's left is to glue these legs together. This is a little bit of a clamping challenge, and a lot of people go back to the whole blue tape thing. I prefer to use electrical tape, actually. It doesn't adhere to the glue in any way, and it's cheap at Harbor Freight. You can buy like a 10-pack for $5, and it goes a long ways. It's stretchy, and it creates just enough clamping pressure where I can kind of candy cane circle around this thing, and that'll hold it until the glue dries. So with those glued up, I can move on to doing the rails and stiles of the framework of this thing. There's going to be some panels that go into it, but here I'm just taking some of the excess from the leg material because it's nice, clean, rift sawn grain, and I'm cutting those stiles and rails. So I got those all cut up, and now you can see what I did is I clamped them down on another flat surface because, well, I'm not going to be able to work on this for a few days because of, well, I have an actual job I have to go do, but I didn't want these to move in the meantime, so this is my insurance to keep them flat. And a few days later I'm back at it, and what I'm going to do here is make the lid. And the lid isn't going to have any support perpendicular to the grain. In order to keep this flat, I'm really being careful to select really good straight grain. I'm going to have one small knot. Unfortunately, that's unavoidable. But I'm trying to be very selective in the way I'm picking my wood out to glue up the lid for this panel. So after trimming that all up and making sure that I have really good straight joints on this that are actually perpendicular and 90 degrees, I want to glue this thing up. And I took a lot of care to make sure that I grain matched as best I could to make it appear like this was one continuous piece of wood. I feel like it turned out pretty good, but we'll see in the end, I guess. With that done, I took the legs out of its electrical tape clamp and cleaned them up, and I'm very happy with how these turned out. And now it's time to start constructing the panels. And instead of using a solid wood panel that I need to leave room for expansion and contraction and have a floating panel, I want to use this as part of the rigidity of this entire build, and I'm going to put solid plywood panels in there with the oak laminated on the outsides of this, and that will stabilize it, and then it'll make my oak go a lot further, and I can kind of grain match this or book match it, And hopefully these panels will turn out nice and they'll be stable, most importantly. And with that done on this single piece that has nice straight grain in it, I'm going to go ahead and resaw this. I'm making 3 pieces out of this singular piece that's about 1/4 of an inch thick to give myself a little bit of room for error on the resaw, but then I'll plane them down to 1/8 of an inch thick, and they'll be sandwiched on top of a 1/4 inch piece of plywood, and that'll end up being 1/2 inch thick in the end. So after I got several of those pieces resawed and planed down, this is the stack of wood I ended up with. I tried to be really careful about making sure, again, I'm using really good straight grain rift sawn wood. That way there's no knots and it's going to have less propensity to warp on me, hopefully. And with that done, then I went ahead and just was really careful about selecting, again, my grain to book match or grain match everything to make the seams as invisible as possible. And I just started gluing these up into the size pieces that I need. This time I'm using blue tape. It'll work very good on this, and it'll hold well as long as you have good straight lines on your joints. So I just repeated that process a whole bunch of times and then clamped a flat panel on it down while it dried, and this is what I ended up with. And this is a substrate I'll be using to veneer the oak on. It's 1/4 inch thick and it's 7 plies, which is quite a few plies for 1/4 inch. Hopefully that provides a stable substrate. I'll just slather glue all over these, clamp a flat panel down, and let the glue dry. I will mention that I did leave these veneer pieces out for a few days while I did some other things and really let it acclimate to that humidity level, which my shop is set for the same humidity levels as most interior homes. So I glued up quite a few of those panels until I ran out of clamps, and I'll do some more afterward. But while I'm waiting for that, we're going to move over to this monstrosity. And this basically cuts mortises. It's my answer to not having a domino. It's something I saw on the Wood Whisperer. I modeled it after something that he had made up. Pros, it creates repeatable accuracy, it's adjustable, and it does work. The cons are it's big and bulky, and it's a bit slow, but it does get the job done. So the concept is it just uses a plunge router and a guide bushing, and you adjust the stops on it to get the exact center on the particular mortise that you're cutting, and you just plunge and cut. And as long as you keep dropping your piece in on center, you're always going to get the same depth. You would keep a reference edge, say the back, always marked, so that way both A and B pieces of the mortise you always mark the back and reference the same. That way, if it is slightly off center, that's always going to match up both flush edges. And now with that mortise cut, I have my tenon stock, which unfortunately is just a tiny bit big. I'll need to just run it through the drum sander, maybe one light pass, and then it should fit perfectly after that. And after adjusting my tenon stock, I cut another one just to show you, and this is a perfect friction fit. I'm very happy with how this thing works out. It creates a lot of accuracy and repeatability, even though it's big and bulky. After that, I went ahead and just cut a whole bunch more of those on the ends of all the rails and stiles, and then I started marking out the legs and positioning the mortises on those. And once I finished all 8 of those on each leg, then I can move on to the next step. Now back over to one of those panels. Here's what one of them looks like. And I wanted to note that I did make sure to put the veneer inside the outside square edges of the plywood panel I was using. That'll make it a lot easier when I get over here to the table saw to square this thing up very nicely. And now once I get this trimmed down to size, I'm very pleased with how it turned out. There's no gaps in the veneer joint. It seems like it's going to work very well in this cabinet. So as you can see, I dry assembled some of the components. This is the face of the whole cabinet. This panel will sit in one of these 3 openings. I'll end up cutting a dado all the way around and then a rabbet on the panel, and it will sit in this opening. I made sure to pay attention to grain direction because I want the grain to run horizontally across the front of it. That was intentional. So now it's over to the router table. I'm going to cut these dados with a 1/4 inch carbide router bit because they're stop dados on the leg. And I'll go ahead, since I have it set up, and just cut all the dados on the stiles and rails the same way instead of moving over to the table saw because the setup's already here. So then I just went through and methodically cut all those dados. As far as the legs go, I made sure to put reference marks on the center at the router table and then the stop mark on the leg, so that way I didn't router too far and cut that dado into the mortise that I already have cut as far as the jointery on the leg. So now it's over to the table saw. I opted to do that for the rabbets because I really wanted to fine tune this fit, and the table saw will allow me to do that with a little bit more ease. So once I got all those rabbets cut on 3 of the front panels and 3 back panels, and then there's 2 side panels, I went ahead and just dry assembled the face one more time to make sure everything fits nicely before I go ahead and break this thing down so I can glue it together. I can glue the front together and then glue the back together, and then once those are dry, then I can assemble the sides. I still need to figure out the bottom. I haven't really addressed that yet, but that's coming. And now I can do just that. I'm going to get this glued up. And unlike my last wood project where the rear panel was really warped and it made the glue up process very difficult, everything's fitted very nicely. And since I can do this thing in segments, I can just do the front now. It's not nearly as intimidating, and it went together very nicely, and this glue up couldn't have gone better. So we'll fast forward to the front and the back being glued up and they are dry. Now it's time to just assemble the sides. To keep this square, I have a piece of plywood that's going to act as a temporary bottom panel while this thing glues up and keeps it square. This glue up went relatively well, and we'll move on. So now with the project dry, I knocked the floor out of it, the temporary floor, which turns out is going to be the permanent floor. And this just went a little bit south, and the quality of this project in some people's mind went down some because, well, it's a plywood bottom in a beautiful white oak cabinet, and I'm using pocket hole screws to hold it in. I know. But there is a little method to the madness. It's going to get casters in the end. This ottoman is going to be able to roll around, and because I'm trying to recess the casters and keep them as invisible as possible, the floor needs to sit up, and that created kind of a joinery problem. So this solves that, even though it's a little bit hideous, if I'm being honest. But that's where we're going. Don't judge me too hard. Well, go ahead and judge me in the comments. It's engagement. I'll take it. So hey, it doesn't look that bad. Come on. I know, it's plywood. But in an attempt to sort of put some lipstick on this pig that is the plywood bottom of this cabinet, I'm going to trim it out to give it just a little bit of pizzazz and a tiny bit of character. Hopefully that helps, but it's the inside of a cabinet. Nobody's going to see the bottom. It's always going to be covered. The intention is it's going to be full of blankets. So the finish I've chosen for the interior is Rubio Monocoat. I've never used it before. Maybe that's why my channel is small. I haven't followed the trend, the Rubio trend. But anyhow, I'm using it for the first time. And it does. It goes down just as easy as everyone says it does. And the finish is quite nice. I've got to hand it to him. This is okay. So now with that done, we can finally move back to the lid, that thing we haven't talked about in like 8 minutes of the video, I guess. But anyhow, I used the track saw to cut it square and then moved over to the table saw to size it. So here's where we're at. The inside has Rubio finish on it. The outside is raw wood. This whole project was a request from my wife. She wanted somewhere to put blankets in the living room, and the ottoman we have now doesn't allow that, so that's what this is. She wants it white, though. And I thought if I was very careful with my wood selection that she would be just appalled at the thought of putting paint on this wood. But it doesn't seem to bother her, so she wants me to paint it white. So we went back and forth, and now we've decided on a light whitewash that hopefully still shows the grain of the oak. So even though it hurts me to put paint on it, here goes. Well, that was not really any fun, but HGTV watchers would be proud. So now with that unpleasantness done, it's time to move on to mounting the hinges. And I have two 12-inch piano hinges that were left over from another project, so I'm going to use those, and they'll work perfectly for this. I'll route out the main area for where these hinges are recessed down in there, and then I'll just use a chisel and very carefully sneak up on the edges to make this thing fit very nicely, because everybody knows that detail is the definition between woodworking and fine woodworking. And I'm going to put some nice detail into fitting this hinge, even though when you look down you see a plywood bottom that screams that it isn't fine woodworking. But we're going to pretend like it is. But now we'll slide this hinge in here, and that fit is a beautiful thing. Now I just use a center finding drill, and I'll get these hinges mounted. We'll have to take them back off later when we go to mount the lid, but for now I'll get those holes all positioned and get these mounted on there. So now for the top coat, I'm just using water-based polyurethane, and I'll put a coat or two over top of it to give it a little bit of durability. But as I do this, the cabinet seems to be getting uglier the further I go. It's like it's transitioning into hideousness before my eyes. But there's not much I can do about it now. All I can do is proceed and hope my wife likes it okay. It kind of has that distressed look, and that's an in thing right now. And then it was back to the lid, and I gave her a good sanding.
Oh, I saw it, honey. You gave her a good scratch.
After that, it was over to the router table to give it a light chamfer. And I had to be careful to make sure that I chamfered the correct side, the show face side. As I near the end of a project, I really start to hurry a little bit because I'm almost done and it's a bit exciting. But I did, thank goodness, route the correct side. And then I gave it one last sanding down to 180. After that, it was just time to put some Rubio on it. And if anybody's wondering, this is actually Rubio with a 5% white tint. And then all that was left was to mount the lid. And I took a lot of care setting the lid on it, making sure it was perfectly square and centered on there, and then very precisely marking out where the location of those hinges will mount on the back of this door, because the spacing for it to fall exactly into the recesses that I cut pretty precisely into the frame of the cabinet need to land perfectly. But I executed that pretty well, and it's lined up exactly the way it should have. So here it is in all its distressed white glory. But my wife liked it, and that's what's important. She did open the lid and sniff the inside and said, "Where's the cedar smell? I thought you were putting cedar on the inside." And either she told me and I forgot, which is entirely possible, or she just didn't tell me. So, enter the cedar bottom insert. I gave it a profile so that it fits perfectly inside and covers up that lovely trim I put down to kind of cover up the plywood. But now when I drop it in here, hey, it covers up that unsightly plywood, and now we get the lovely cedar smell inside the chest. Problem solved. And now I can put a bow on this one and move it into the house. Maybe I'll do that, find a giant bow. But my wife's happy, and that's what's important. So here's a few glamour shots so you can see the finished product, and hey look, even the dogs approve. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.